Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet ache of a time forgotten, when the last whispers of the Roman world had faded into the mist, and Britain stood shivering in its own shadow. There were no emperors left, no legions to march the roads. Straight and proud, just ruins, swallowed by vines and silence. The world had not ended, not quite, but it had slipped into something slower, softer perhaps, or maybe just quieter. The kind of quiet that hums beneath the surface of things. Fields still grew coarse wheat. Children still laughed when the sun broke through the fog. But everything felt smaller, as if the horizon had shrunk. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? In this strange, in-between time, before kings had crowns and before churches had steeples, people lived not in castles, but in clusters. They built their homes from what the earth gave them: mud, sticks, wool, and the breath of animals. They didn't call it the Dark Ages. That came later. To them, it was just life. One foot after another through the morning frost. One bowl of thin porridge shared across a table that leaned slightly to the left. A thin curtain of smoke curled from the thatched roof. A dog barked. Somewhere, a spoon clinked against a clay bowl. The wind was always there, pressing against the walls, asking to come in. There were no histories being written, no great battles sung. But every sigh, every laugh, every moment someone pulled their shawl tighter around their shoulders. Those were the chapters no one recorded. And that's where we begin. So tonight, we'll step quietly into the flickering lamplight of their world. A world woven together from cold breath and warm hands. A world almost lost, but not quite. The fire is low, the bed is rough, the night is long. But you're not alone. And that brings us to chapter 1, where the empire ends and something quieter begins. The roads didn't vanish all at once. At first, they just grew quieter. Grass began to push through the cracks between the stones. The wheels of carts still rolled over them, but more slowly now and less often. The great villas stood empty. Roofs collapsed under their own weight. Mosaic floors, once gleaming with color, faded beneath dust and moss. No one came to sweep them. No one came at all. And so the empire fell not with a bang, but with a breath. A long, slow exhale. One day, someone simply didn't return. A trader didn't show up. A garrison went silent. The last tax collector packed his scrolls and vanished over the hill. And what was left behind was waiting. The people didn't. More Rome. Most of them had never seen it. Rome had always been far away, a whisper on a silver coin, a rumor from a soldier's mouth. What they mourned, if anything, was predictability. The feeling that someone out there had a plan, even if that plan taxed your barley and told you how to pray. Now, there were no orders. No orders meant no punishments either, but also no help. When the roof leaked or the roads washed out, or the wolves came closer to the edge of the field, a woman stood outside a sagging hut, eyes squinting into the fog. She held a child on her hip and felt the mud sucking at her ankles. Somewhere nearby, a rooster called once, then again, then fell silent. Inside the hut, there was bread if they were lucky. More often, just grain. Ground coarse, boiled thin, and eaten slowly with wooden spoons passed from hand to hand. The bowl was cracked, but it still held heat, and that was enough. Life was no longer about advancement. It was about rhythm, seasons rising and falling like breath. Frost, thaw, growth, harvest, hunger, always hunger. Sometimes loud, sometimes quiet. But the people stayed. They always did. They built new lives on top of the old ones. Wood where there had been stone, mud where there had been marble. Chickens pecked at ruins. Children played with shattered pottery, as if it had always been there. And perhaps in their world it had died at night. The wind moved through the empty temples and forgotten fortresses, slipping between cracks, howling like it remembered what this place had once been. The people didn't speak of it, but they felt it. And that brings us to the hearth, the fog, and the life that glowed faintly in the dark. Hut could be many things. Could be cold in the morning and warm by evening. It could creak when the wind blew or stand stubborn and silent. It could smell of smoke, sweat, sheep, and something sweet you couldn't quite name. Inside, a fire always burned, or tried to. The fire was the heartbeat. It smoked, sputtered, coughed like an old man. But when it truly caught it, glowed like memory. It whispered to the bones of the hut, climbing up through the roof's thatch, curling into the rafters. You didn't just cook over the fire. You dried your socks there. You sat beside it and combed lice from your sleeves. You watched your child take their first steps toward it and panicked. You stared into it when no one else was speaking. It lit the edges of everything. The woolen cloak hanging on a peg, the curve of a spoon, the gleam in someone's eyes just before they smiled. But smoke always lingered. It crawled into your lungs, into your clothes, into your dreams. Some said it kept illness away. Others said it brought it in. But no one opened a window. There was no glass, only holes. And wind was worse than smoke. So they sat around the fire. Old ones, young ones, goats when it was cold. Sometimes a chicken found its way in. No one minded. Meals were simple. Porridge with scraps, a bit of root, maybe beans. If you had salt, you were lucky. If you had meat, you were celebrating. And the fog, oh, the fog, it never really left. It clung to the outside walls. It breathed under the door. It wrapped itself around the village and said, "This is all there is. Don't look beyond." And the people listened. Or they didn't, but they stayed. Because inside, by the fire, there was a kind of peace. Not joy, not even comfort, but peace. The kind that wraps around the ankles and says, "You made it through another day." No one said grace aloud. But when the fire was fed and the fog stayed outside, that was enough. And that brings us to the places that had no name, but still held meaning. No one carved signs. No one mapped it out. There was no need. The village was known only by the people who lived in it and by the dirt they pressed with their feet. It had no title, no crest, no lord. Just a winding path, a handful of thatched roofs, and smoke that rose in the same direction every morning. It wasn't large. A dozen huts, maybe more. Children counted them sometimes, starting over every time. They forgot which one they'd begun with. There was a pig pen that stank of life, and a bend in the road where someone once planted a tree that never grew straight. The field stretched around the edges, modest and unspoken. Wheat if the season was kind, oats if not, turnips if nothing else. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. People didn't come and go much. The path out of town led to trees. And rumors. Occasionally, a stranger passed through. Eyes watched from behind wool curtains. Children peeked and ran. But most days were spent among the same hands, the same faces. Names mattered, but only just the one who sings was enough. Or the tall one who limps, the woman who smells of honey, the boy with 2 left boots. News came late, if at all. A sickness in a town no one had seen, a fire far away, a man with a horse and a sword and a warning. And then silence again, and the village endured. Chickens squawked in the morning. Bread was baked when there was flour. Walls were patched with whatever would stick. Children grew, argued, forgot things. Old people stared at the sky. There were no clocks. Only the sun, the cold, and the hunger that came when the moon stayed too long. But the village held its people like a hand holds water, gently, imperfectly, and just long enough. And that brings us to the things they wore, not for beauty, but for survival. Clothing wasn't fashion. It was function. A second skin made of whatever wouldn't rot too fast. Wool was everything. It itched, but it lasted. It clung to you in the cold and let you sweat through it in the summer. It smelled of the sheep it once was, and the fire you slept beside. Spun it slowly, with fingers that cracked and bled. A spindle twirled like a spell. The yarn came out uneven, but no one cared. Coats were patched upon patches, handed down so many times the original color was only a guess. Shoes were tougher. Leather, if they had it. If not, thick wrappings tied with hope and twine. Feet knew mud as a friend, and the mud knew them back. Children ran barefoot until their toes turned blue. Adults did too, when the shoes gave out or the stitching snapped. No. Two cloaks were the same, though no one ever tried to be different. A frayed edge here, a burn mark there, a thread of red that stood out like a heartbeat. Hats, when worn, were practical. Hoods were better. They caught the rain, hid the hair, softened the wind. They didn't block out the cold, but they gave the illusion of protection, and sometimes that was more valuable. Underneath, linen if you could afford it. Rougher stuff if you couldn't. Layers were everything. A poor man in winter looked twice his size, just from all the fabric tied around him. Washing clothes wasn't weekly or monthly. It was necessary only sometimes. Soap was rare. Water was colder than most dared. So they wore their dirt proudly. It kept the bugs away, they said. Or at least they hoped it did. But when spring came and the first river thawed, women gathered at the banks with arms full of clothing and laughter that echoed like freedom. And that brings us to the meal that mattered most whenever it could be made. It began with flour, or something like it. Not white and soft like stories tell. This was coarse, brown, gritty, ground by hand between stones, full of little bits that shouldn't have been their pebbles. Husk dreams. The dough was heavy, like worry. It sat in a bowl carved from wood, covered with a cloth that had known better days. It didn't rise much, but it tried. They added water from the well, or the stream, or melted snow, if it had to be. Sometimes salt, rarely honey. If luck had come early, a handful of dried herbs. If luck had not come at all, nothing. The fire had to be coaxed into life. The embers stirred, a breath, a prayer, a bit of bark. The kindling caught, and with it, hope. The oven was stone, cracked, soot-covered, familiar. It took time to heat, and even more time to cool. The bread was shaped by hand, rough fingers, scarred palms, slapped into round loaves or flat discs, placed on stones, covered, waited for it. Smelled of earth and smoke and hunger. When it burned, it still got eaten. The black crust was chipped away, dipped in broth, softened with patience. When it didn't burn, it was gone too fast. The first bite was sacred. Soft inside, still warm, maybe steam. Maybe not. It didn't matter. Children fought over the corners. Elders took only a piece. Mothers tore their own portion smaller. Bread was more than food. It was rhythm. It was the center of the day, the reason to light the fire, the moment everyone stopped talking. When there was bread, things felt possible. And that brings us to the sound that meant morning had begun, whether you liked it or not. Long. Before the sun even considered rising, the rooster called. It didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for warmth. It simply stood on one foot, puffed its chest and shouted into the dark like it had something urgent to declare. No one ever quite understood what. The hut was still. Bodies curled on straw, wrapped in wool, breathing slow and heavy. A child shifted in sleep. A man scratched his beard without waking. A dog stirred, sniffed, and sighed. Then dash again. The rooster crowed. And with it, the unspoken truth. The day had begun. There were no clocks, no alarms. The rhythm was the wind, the cold, the stomach, the bird. That strange, stubborn bird. A mother rose first. Always the mother. Her knees ached. Her hands were stiff. She moved slowly, so as not to wake the littlest ones. Her feet found the icy floor, then the hearth. The fire had died. Of course it had. A few embers blinked up at her, like tired eyes refusing to close. She coaxed them back. A stick, a whisper, a blow of breath that sounded like a lullaby in reverse. A glow, a flicker, then flame. She warmed her hands. Her face softened in the light, and the rooster crowed again. Outside, mist clung low over the yard. Ground, the path was wet. The trees stood like watchers. Somewhere, something moved in the underbrush. Too tired or too cold to care if it was seen. The men would rise soon. There were fences to mend and animals to check. The pigs always tested the gate. The goats always found a way out. But for now, it was the quiet hour. The hour of breath and wool and silence. Before the tools clinked, before the boots thudded, before the field swallowed the day, she ladled out the broth, what was left of last night's roots and bones. She broke the bread. She whispered names until the hut woke slowly, like a bear stretching in its den. And outside, the rooster cried. One last time. His job done. And that brings us to the day beyond the door, the soil, the sky, and the work that never asked for thanks. The field didn't care who you were. It didn't matter if your back ached or your fingers were raw. It waited, patient, demanding, silent. The tools were simple. A wooden hoe, a shovel with a handle smoothed by years of calloused hands, a basket mended 3 times and still fraying. Nothing sharp, nothing fast. The work began when the mist lifted just enough to see your toes. And it didn't end until the sky began to darken again. That gray fade that said, enough. Go home now. But the hours in between were long. They tilled the soil with slow, rhythmic motion. Scrape, turn, breathe. Scrape, turn, breathe. Stones were pulled and tossed aside into piles that grew year after year and never seemed to shrink. Sometimes they sang. Low, humming songs, more vibration than melody. It helped to keep the rhythm. It helped the silence feel less empty. Crows watched from fences. Worms twisted through the clods. The soil was dark, but not always rich. Some seasons gave back. Others took everything. Children carried buckets of water. Their arms shook. Their eyes wandered. A boy dug with a stick instead of helping, until his grandmother called his name without raising her voice. Lunch, if it could be called that, was bread in a cloth, an onion shared, a cup of something warm. They sat in a circle under the barest hint of shade, shoulders touching. And then back to it. The field didn't punish, but it also didn't forgive. When the wind rose, it threw dust in your eyes. When it rained, it made mud of everything. Your boots, your socks, your sense of dignity. But when the crop came in thin sheaves of barley, nobbled turnips, beans like little coins, there was a joy so quiet you almost missed it. A small smile, a hand on a shoulder, a nod that said, we made it. This time. And that brings us to the only building where silence meant something more than exhaustion. There were no bells. Not yet. The church was wood, not stone. It leaned slightly to one side. The roof leaked in 3 places, but no one mentioned it. It was sacred. Even when it wasn't dry. The door creaked open with a sound like breath through old lips. Inside, it was cool, even in summer. The air felt different, still, heavy with something that had no name. Benches, if there were any, were splintered. Most sat on the floor, backs straight, hands folded, eyes low. There were no stained glass windows, just slits for light. The sun found its way in like a quiet visitor, casting patterns on the dirt floor that looked like fingers reaching out. The priest was local. His robes were patched. His words were slow. He spoke Latin sometimes. No one understood, but the rhythm soothed them. It felt like protection. There were no sermons about heaven, just prayers for rain, for health, for fewer rats in the grain bins, for a safe birth, for a peaceful death. People came not because they believed in miracles, but because they believed. In habit, in showing up, in sitting together, in silence that meant something. Sometimes someone wept. Quietly, a baby cried. A dog padded in, then out again. A song would begin, off-key, shaky, then stronger. Everyone joined in, not to impress, but to remember. The melody was older than any of them. There was no organ, just voices, worn and real. And when it ended, they stood. They nodded to one another. They left in the same silence they'd come in with. Outside, the sky felt different. Not brighter, just steadier. And that brings us to the small joys found beside the hearth, where laughter was whispered, not shouted. The roof above was never truly silent. It crackled with birds in the morning and hissed under rain by night. It was made of straw, tied tight, layered thick, patched with care and hope. Every family had a patch of their own that they swore leaked more than the others. Beneath that roof, life hummed low and soft. The hearth glowed, not with flames, but with embers steady, slow, familiar. A kettle sat crooked over it, steam rising, like a ghost sigh. A pot of something boiled, then softened into mush. And around the fire, voices murmured. It wasn't conversation in the modern sense. No arguments, no politics, just life. One woman spoke of her goat's bad leg. Another recalled a dream where the well sang to her. Someone asked if the priest's sister was really a midwife, or just liked being in control. The words slipped. Through the smoke, light as ash, laughter was gentle. Not loud enough to wake the baby swaddled in the corner. Just a smile, a nod, a nudge of the knee. Children played with wooden spoons and scraps of wool. They built kingdoms in the dirt by the doorway, unaware that their castles would be stepped on by supper. A boy pulled his sister's braid. She hit him with a stick. Their mother didn't look up, just reached back and tapped his forehead with 2 fingers, as if erasing the mischief from his mind. The air was always thick with scent onions, old shoes, warm wool, damp wood. No one noticed. It was the smell of survival. A rooster wandered inside. No one chased it out. There were no doors, only cloths, no privacy, only space. And yet, somehow, everything sacred was kept safe. They didn't gossip for sport. They gossiped for rhythm, for story, for something to hold on to in the long stretch between seasons. And when the fire dimmed and the coals whispered low, the voices faded too, replaced by breath, by hush, by sleep. And that brings us to the dirt they wore with pride, where filth was more than just grime. It was armor. The dirt wasn't filth. Not to them. It was work. It was warmth. It was everything they touched and everything that clung to them in return. Their hands were never truly clean. Under each fingernail lived the memory of a root pulled, a pot scrubbed, a sheep tended. The lines of their palms ran dark with earth and ash, and something sacred. Bathing was rare. The river was cold. The tub, if it existed, was a wooden barrel that groaned when filled. Soap was precious. Water was colder than bravery. So they bathed in parts, a rag to the neck, a splash behind the ears, feet rubbed clean only when the smell outweighed the energy it cost to care. Lice were constant companions. Nits combed from heads with patience and fingernails. Mothers checked. Daughters, fathers, not so much. They just scratched and moved on. Clothes weren't washed. They were aired out, held above fire smoke, beaten with sticks near the riverbanks. And yet they stood with dignity. Their pride wasn't in being clean. It was in enduring. A man with calloused feet didn't complain. A woman with soot on her cheek still sang to her child. And in the church, no one turned their nose, because they all knew filth meant labor, and labor meant life. Their homes smelled of damp straw, old meat, and smoke. But it was their smoke, their straw, their scent of perseverance. And sometimes, just sometimes after a rain, the village steamed like a pot left too long on the fire. And for a moment, everything felt soft again. And that brings us to the night, and to the bed shared by beasts and breath alike. Beds weren't beds. They were piles of straw, sometimes woven mats, sometimes nothing at all. A family slept in layers. Children tucked into corners. Grandparents folded like old paper. The baby between them all, wrapped in wool and breath. And just beyond the curtain, or sometimes not beyond it at all, stood the cow. Its breath was warm, its eyes slow and blinking, its body a wall against the wind. It didn't complain because it was fed, and its presence meant heat. The goat had her own corner. The chickens roosted high or low, or wherever they could find. A dog, if they had one, curled at someone's feet. A cat, never owned but always present, slid between bodies like smoke. There were no nightshirts. Just day clothes, worn thinner. No pillows. Just folded arms or sacks of moss. No lullabies except for the soft sound of chewing, shifting, snoring. Sleep came in shifts. When the wind howled, someone stirred the fire. When a child cried, a mother whispered. When the cow groaned, someone checked her legs. But the room was safe, alive with breathing, layered in sound. No one felt alone. And in the coldest months, when the frost clung to the walls and the moonlight painted everything silver, that shared breath kept them from breaking. And that brings us to the child who looked up and saw something ancient in the sky. He didn't know their names, not the way scholars did, but he knew their shapes. There was the hunter, the stag, the bent old woman with a cane made of light, the little one called Fish's Tooth, though no one knew why. At night, when the world curled inward and the village lay in its hush, the boy lay on a hill outside the fence. A patch of grass just high enough to feel far. He didn't bring a blanket. He didn't bring anything. Just his eyes and his thoughts and the sky. The stars shimmered, not like candles, like frost, cold and constant. He'd point them out to his sister, who came once and never again. Too cold, she said. But he stayed. Night after night, they were his only maps. He made up stories for them. Tales of pigs that flew between stars. A tree that reached across the sky. A boy who climbed it to steal fire. He didn't speak these stories aloud. Not yet. They weren't ready. But he held them. And sometimes, when he returned to the hut, cheeks red, hands numb, he looked at the adults with quiet understanding. They walked beneath the stars. He lived inside them. And that brings us to what lay beneath his feet. The bones of a world that still whispered in stone. The stones remembered. Even as the moss crept in, even as the grass split them apart, the old Roman roads held their shape. Beneath the silence, straight lines in a world that had turned to circles. Forgotten paths carved through fields no one crossed anymore. Children played on them without knowing. They traced the edges with sticks, dragged their feet along the cracks, balanced like dancers. To them, it was just a strange kind of floor. But the elders remembered Dot, not the Empire. No one remembered that, but the stories told in whispers. Of men in red cloaks and sandals, walking tall and fast. Of wagons that rumbled with such purpose, the ground trembled. Now, only footsteps sounded. Here, slow ones, a girl fetching water, a widow on her way to see the priest, the crunch of frost beneath worn shoes. Sometimes a traveler appeared on the road, not often. But when they did, heads turned, doors stayed ajar longer. The dogs barked more than usual. No one trusted what came from far away. Yet the road remained, unmoving, unapologetic. Dot. It ran past the edge of the village, through woods that smelled of old bark and damp leaves, past a broken wall where brambles had grown thick in the foliage. Proud, and beyond that, no one knew. Some said it led to the sea. Others said it led to ruins filled with treasure. Others still said it led nowhere at all, just vanished beneath the earth, swallowed by time. But on quiet nights, when the wind died down and the moon was bright, it glowed faintly, a shimmer in the dirt, a memory made of stone. Dot, and in those moments, it felt as if someone was coming, or had just passed. And that brings us to the one who healed not with herbs alone, but with hands that knew what pain was made of. She lived near the edge of the woods. Her roof sagged a little more each year, and the smoke from her chimney always smelled different, not like meat, not like wood, like something in between, something green. She wasn't feared, exactly. But no one knocked loudly on her door. They came with sick babies and twisted ankles, fevers and swollen bellies. They came when the church's prayers didn't quite reach, when the bone felt wrong, when the blood wouldn't stop, when the sleep was too deep. Dot, she rarely spoke, just looked, then moved. Her fingers brushed the leaves in her baskets, pinched. Stems crushed things between her palms. The inside of her hut was full of hanging bundles, dried herbs, roots, seeds. 1,000 smells mingled in the air. Mint, mold, old firewood, something bitter. She made teas that tasted like bark, poultices that stung, broths that brought color back to lips. And she listened. While she stirred or wrapped or mashed, she listened to the words and the silences in between. She remembered who cried when they spoke, and who didn't speak at all. She asked for nothing. But people left gift eggs, cloth, a carved spoon, a good word whispered behind her back. She wasn't a witch, not really. She didn't claim to know the stars or see death. She just understood the body like it was an old friend who'd forgotten how to behave. Some said she once lost a child. Others said she was once a child who was lost and never came back the same. But no one asked. And when someone recovered, when the cough faded, when the baby suckled, when the shaking stopped, people said it was luck, or prayer, or her hands. That brings us to another kind of cure, the kind found not in leaves, but in songs shared beside firelight. The songs didn't rhyme. Not always. They drifted through the air like smoke, slow, uneven, curling in places you didn't expect. A hum while weaving, a murmur while peeling turnips, a quiet lullaby that carried across rooftops. No one remembered where they started. Some were older than the priest, older than the road, maybe older than the village itself, passed down like recipes without measurements. Women sang the most, while working, while nursing, while waiting. Men joined in after ale. Their voices, deep, worn, uncertain, but still they sang. Children learned the melodies before they learned to speak in full. They filled in the ends of verses with guesses. They added new lines when the old ones no longer fit. There were songs for planting, for mourning, for births, for teeth coming in, for wind that wouldn't stop. Some songs were nonsense. Others hid secrets. A woman might sing about a swan, but everyone knew she meant her husband. A man might sing of the river, but it was really his grief. Flowing and flowing at night, the fire crackled and the smoke twisted upward. And someone would begin, not loudly, not dramatically, just softly. The others followed, and for a while there was no hunger, no dampness in the corners, no ache in the knees, just breath and warmth and words stretched into sound. And that brings us to the edge of the woods, where not all fears had faces. They never came into the village, not often, not close, but they were there, just beyond. The line where the fields ended and the woods began, just past the last fence post, where the grass grew taller and the trees pressed in too tight. You could hear them sometimes, not howling, not always, just moving. A rustle too steady to be wind, a crack of branch that sounded like a warning. Silence that felt watched. The children knew not to follow rabbits too far. The hunters carried knives that were never clean. And the fire by the edge of the field was never allowed to die. Wolves were not just animals. They were story and shadow and shape. The thing you warned against. The thing you left meat scraps for at the far edge of the clearing, just in case it bought you one more quiet night. They never took the strong ones, always the lambs, the sickly pigs, the goat with the limp, sometimes a dog, and once a child. Or so they said. The details blurred. It became a warning, not a memory, a mother's stern voice. A fence that grew taller every year. But fear was not just for wolves. There were other things in the woods. Flickers of red eyes, stories of pale women who sang backwards, tree stumps, shaped like kneeling men. Spirits that followed you home, unless you spun in a circle and spat twice before reaching the gate. Not everyone believed, but everyone acted like they did. A sprig of dried herbs over the door. A carved charm hung by the pig pen. A song sung twice, under breath. The wolves reminded them. Life was fragile. Light was borrowed. And the dark could still take what it wanted. But life continued anyway. And it brings us to a colder truth. How warmth was made not of wood, but of bodies and belief. The fire had gone out again. Not from carelessness, just from lack. The woodpile had been wet for 3 days, and the logs hissed more than they burned. The bark peeled back like old scabs, and the center was always cold. So they layered wool upon wool, a cloak wrapped twice, blankets that had seen too many winters. One child tucked inside another, a cat on the feet, a dog on the chest, a chicken, sometimes on the knee. They lay like spoons in a drawer, bent, breathing, silent. Filth helped. Dirt was insulation. The straw in the bed was full of things that crawled, but it was dry. And when you laid down in it, it sighed beneath you like it understood. They drank warm things when they could. Not tea, but boiled broth. Water that had touched onions. Milk. That was almost too sour. The wind found its way in. Always. Through the cracks beneath the door. Along the seams of the roof. It slid in like a whisper and stayed. But they stayed warmer when they didn't move. When they held still and let the heat grow from within. Laughter helped. So did stories. So did dreams of summer, of sun on stones, of bare feet, of sweat trickling down the back of your neck. Hope was a kind of heat. So was stubbornness. You did not need a roaring fire to survive. Just enough glow to see each other's faces. Just enough to light one corner of the dark. And that brings us to the season when light barely returned and survival became an art of silence. It arrived slowly. Then all at once, first the mornings darkened, then the wind bit, then the ground froze with a sound like cracking teeth. Winter didn't ask permission. It simply took. The days shrank like fabric washed too many times. What little sun there was stretched low and thin across the ground. The chickens stopped laying. The goats shivered. Even the trees looked smaller. Food was rationed. Every slice of bread was measured. The root cellar was visited with reverence. A turnip was a prize. A dried apple was a miracle. Voices grew softer, as if sound itself might waste energy. People didn't visit. Doors stayed shut. Feet stayed wrapped. Even gossip grew cold and quiet. Babies were born anyway. So were illnesses. Life didn't stop, it just moved slower. Like honey in frost, they chewed more than they swallowed, drank more than they tasted, slept more than they dreamed. Got sometimes someone didn't wake up, and it wasn't spoken of loudly, just understood. A blanket pulled over the head, a prayer, a space by the fire that remained empty. But there were moments when someone laughed too loud at a joke no one else heard, when the snow fell so thick it made the world feel soft, when a child made a face from soot and stuck it on the wall. Moments when winter wasn't winning. And that brings us to the man who remembered stories when no one else wanted to speak. He wasn't old, but he looked it. His beard was thin, his back bent like a question, his eyes cloudy, but always watching. No one knew where he came from. He'd just been there, sitting near the fire, nodding, muttering. He didn't ask for food, but he was always fed. He didn't ask for warmth, but someone always tossed him a blanket. He told stories. Not long ones, not epic ones, just stories. Of birds that turned into girls, of men who dug holes so deep they found the other side of sadness, of rivers that remembered your name. The children gathered first, then the women, then the tired ones. He didn't change his tone. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke like someone stirring soup, slow, thoughtful, with pauses you could rest inside. Sometimes he forgot the end, made up new ones. No one minded. He didn't have teeth, but his smile was whole. When he was silent, the fire crackled louder. And when he spoke, the wind seemed to still. Some nights, he wept during a tale. No one asked why. A girl reached out and touched his hand once. He didn't stop her. He never stayed long. One morning, he was just gone, but they remembered his stories. Told them again, got them wrong, got them right, added things, left things, but always began the same way. There was a man once, and that brings us to a time before clocks, when songbirds and shadows marked the hours. There were no bells yet, not the kind that echoed through valleys or called across towns, not the great iron voices we now associate with churches and kings. Time, back then, was quieter. It was marked by the rising mist, the shadow of a tree on the wall, the way the sun hit the hearth at midday, a dog barking at nothing, a rooster late to his duties, a baby waking before anyone else. The rhythm of the day came not from clocks, but from customs. The morning meal, if it could be called that, was a piece of bread, a sip of something warm, the slow gathering of strength. Then the chores, like beads on a string. Feed the animals, patch the roof, spin the thread, gather the wood. By the time the sun reached its highest point, no one looked up. They simply felt it. The warmth on them, on back of the neck, the dry soil between fingers. The brief quiet that came when everyone, everywhere, seemed to stop at once. Then the descent. Shadows grew longer, voices softer, meals heartier, if the day had been kind. Fires lit, doors closed, prayers whispered. And in place of bells, there were birds, crows that signaled dusk. owls that called across fields, songbirds that marked the slow surrender of day into night. Before time was kept, it was lived, not counted, not chased, known. And that brings us to the way they said goodbye, not with trumpets or tombs, but with earth, cloth, and silence. There were no headstones, no marble, no names carved into anything that would last. Just earth, dug soft, sometimes frozen. Just a cloth, maybe wool, maybe linen if the family had saved. Just a moment, heavy and wordless. Death came quietly. It didn't knock. It simply stood at the door and waited. Sometimes they saw it coming. A cough that wouldn't go. A wound that wouldn't close. Eyes that stopped meeting other eyes. Sometimes it came overnight. There were no coffins, just wrappings. The body curled like sleep. Hands folded. Eyes closed by someone who knew them well. Or not at all. They didn't cry the way we think of. Crying. It was too deep for that. Too tired. Too familiar. Just the kind of silence that pressed in around the ribs. A few words, if someone knew what to say. A song half mumbled. A hand pressed to the forehead, then to the soil. The children were told stories. That the dead went to the stars, or turned into wind, or became part of the bread that would rise better this spring, and maybe they did. Place where they were buried wasn't marked, not always. But everyone remembered. Everyone knew. That patch of earth near the ash tree. That mound near the stream. That spot where the grass grew thickest. They were never truly gone. Not with thee. Bowl still on the shelf. The shawl still on the peg. The laugh still echoing in someone's dream. And that brings us to the final hour, when the whole village exhaled together. The doors were drawn shut. The fires had burned low. The smoke curled upward like fading thoughts. And the village without. Banner without border, without name slept. Cows shifted in the straw. Chickens blinked in the dark. A child coughed once, then turned deeper into her blanket. No carts rattled. No bells rang. No song stirred the air. Only breath. And the sound of wind pressing against the roof as if asking to be let in. The moon hung above like an old watchman, casting a cold silver on rooftops that had seen too many winters. A dog barked once, then thought better of it. Inside the huts, families lay tangled in sleep. Fathers with one boot still on. Mothers with arms curled around infants. Teenagers dreaming of things they didn't have names for. Above them, herbs hung from rafters. Dried bundles swaying slightly in the draft. Below them, the earth waited, patient, warmed by all that rested above. No one kept time. No one marked the hour. But the entire village, as if on cue, slipped into stillness. Even the fire gave one last breath, a flicker, then a sigh. And in that hush, something sacred held the air. Not peace, exactly, but something older, something like belonging. And that brings us to the final thought, a closing image held gently in the palm of sleep. It always came slowly, with fanfare, not with brilliance, just a pale light pressing gently at the edges of the world. The frost had crept in during the night, painting every thatched roof with a quiet sheen. The breath of cows rose in puffs. The fields were still, and yet, somewhere, someone stirred. The fire, long dead, needed coaxing. Fingers, stiff with cold, reached into ash, found a coal, found a spark, found a reason. And again, life began. The rooster crowed, a little hoarse this time. A child stretched, blinking. A goat bleated. A spoon clinked in a bowl. No one spoke much. In the morning, words came later, after warmth, after food, after breath. But in those first minutes, with the sun still deciding whether to show itself, the world felt paused. Like a story waiting to be told again. They rose. They washed what could be washed. They swept the corners. They cracked the ice in the bucket. They stepped out into a day that looked just like the last one. And the one before that, Dot, but it wasn't. The same, because someone had been born, or died, or left, or simply endured. The village had changed in ways only the wind remembered, and the ghosts of old roads sighed beneath the earth, and the cows, as always, waited to be milked, Dot, and the songs, those strange, half-lost melodies drifted back in, soft as morning breath. Maybe, just maybe, the stars still watched, because in this place with no name, where history forgot to write things down, the people never really vanished. They were here, Dot, in the walls, Dot, in the bread, Dot, in the silence that came just before the roosters called, Dot, and now, so are you. If you're still with me, leave a soft like, and maybe subscribe if it feels right. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, may your night be warm. May your dreams be kind, Dot, and may morning come gently again.